Okay, great. So, yeah, this is the third event in a series Eleni Axiotti, Ricardo Rivo, and I put together called the Crisis Cycle. Sessions 1, 2, and 3 are on Tuesdays. The final one is next Tuesday. And they're hour-long sort of lunchtime session seminars on themes from the history of political economy, relating it to present struggles, present crises, and how to connect political economy to architecture. This event is the main event, though, of the cycle. I'm going to give a brief introduction of the title. So, radical reform revolution. The three of us have been thinking about this for several years now. My thinking on it began after a very interesting exchange within the AA PhD program some years ago. It was a presentation of student work, and I was presenting my thesis in which I outlined what I'm sure was an overly abstract kind of philosophical critique of political theory within architectural discourse. I argued that certain kinds of ostensibly radical theory were incapable of producing a properly radical architectural politics. And I employed all kinds of philosophical arguments for this. At the time, I was a kind of Badiouian philosophy person. And I mean, I still like Badiou, but I'm not a Badiouian anymore. Pier Vittorio Relli, who was there and is the current head of the AA's PhD program, made a really useful critique of what I was saying, basically. And he made it on two counts. First, that the radical, quote unquote, was an imprecise concept, really a kind of buzzword that should be replaced with more rigorous terms. Second count, that in any case, it was clear that the discipline of architecture was inherently and inevitably reformist. So given this modest political horizon, it was pointless to debate this or that kind of radicalism. Now, the power of the first point struck me immediately. I was indeed using the term radical as a kind of euphemism for a political program I was at that point either unable or unwilling to spell out explicitly. The second point was more complicated, but I think it had a greater impact on my thinking and in the discussions that I had with Rick and Eleni afterward. To start with, it makes intuitive sense. The production of architecture is an expensive and complex social process. Architects must therefore work within established social and institutional mechanisms for modest improvements rather than radical transformations. However, what are the improvements, the reforms to which contemporary architects contribute? And I'm speaking here about architects in the West to begin with. No public housing is being built, basically. Little to no public utilities or infrastructure. Reform and the reformism of architecture are actually constrained historically by the real functioning of the building sector within the economy as a whole. Without the reformism of the welfare state, without a larger reformist context in society, it's practically impossible for architects to be reformist in any meaningful sense. I think this is particularly clear in professional work, where there are no public planning offices to hire you that aren't subservient to private development in some basic way. Architects can try to negotiate on the margins of private development for public improvements. And I think while this is definitely a laudable struggle, the results are massively limited by the larger political economic context of contemporary practice. And I think we have to admit that they fall far short of the scale of the problems that need to be addressed. In the academy, the situation, I think, is similar. It would be theoretically possible to teach a studio unit on council housing in Britain, but its conceptual conservatism and counterfactual historical premises would be mediated, if not overwhelmed, by the demands for discursive and formal innovation that dominate an academy, which is really no less embedded within neoliberal capitalism than the profession outside the academy. In this context, I think an amorphous radicalism can be far more organic to the architectural discipline as it currently exists than past and present struggles toward reform, to say nothing of revolutionary struggle. Because it is amorphous and because of its systemic basis, both right and left-leaning architectural discourses and practices exist within the radical, challenging each other with alternative versions, alternative radicalisms. Patrick Schumacher, I think, is no less committed to the radical in some sense than the projects against which he rails in public discourse and that spar back with him. Today, in the midst of multiple and overlapping crises, when we are witnessing the return of political struggle and the articulation of very concrete reforms, from the Green New Deal to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex, to public housing, to Medicare for all, or in Britain to save the NHS, and beyond these reforms, we're seeing a serious articulation of a revolutionary anti-capitalism in the face of mounting neoliberal and climatic apocalypse. I think under these conditions, one need no longer use the euphemistic cover of a term like radical. So this symposium aims to explore how the broad category of the radical in architecture and the larger field of cultural production maybe, how that relates to this resurgence of concrete left politics. So next slide. So the event is composed of 3 panels. The first panel, which will begin in a moment, is themed "The Academic as Split Political Subject." The second panel, from 4:45 to 6:15 in London time, is "Architectural Solutions for Politics or Political Solutions for Architecture." The third panel, "Architecture and the Struggle for Development," will begin at 6:30. And the structure of each panel and kind of the way we conceived of the event is to focus on the discussion side. So brief presentations by each speaker will be of a kind of position paper aimed at setting up the discussion and the debate, which happens in the discussion afterwards. So we didn't intend this to be a typical symposium with academic papers in depth and at length, followed by a limited discussion. We really want to use the brief talks to push the discussion. Okay, that's it for me for now. The 3 of us are going to take turns moderating. So I'll kick it to Ricardo, who will moderate panel 1.
Yeah, hi. So, just let me find that all of the things online at the same time introduces slight specific complexity. Okay. Yeah, so we are going to kick on with the first panel now. First of all, I must note that unfortunately, Jane Randall, who would be present with us in this panel, will not be able to join. She had a kind of last-minute issue of a personal nature that could not be avoided. So it's very unfortunate that we will not have her here with us. The third panel, the first panel will be composed of Douglas Spencer and Eleni Axiotti. So the idea of the first panel is to discuss and explore the ways in which, in the current moment, the architect slash academic and academic architect exists in a kind of tense relationship, which is not simple. It's not simple and it's not easy with the concreteness of the political struggle as it develops. Politicized practices in architectural academia have been increasingly carrying their own internal tensions. Political agency tends to be understood within the field through radical and critical practices. Yet these are themselves conditioned by larger disciplinary and professional institutions. So in this session, what we'll do is explore the resulting ideological and practical contradictions, most evident when academics attempt to connect wider political and labor struggles. This is the theme that we set out to the speakers as well. So I will introduce Douglas Spencer. Douglas Spencer is a Pickard-Chilton professor and director of graduate education at architecture at Iowa State University. He's the author of The Architecture of Neoliberalism in 2016 and Critique of Architecture, very fresh, just came out essentially. It was launched here at the AA like a month ago. And he has written for Radical Philosophy, Log, eFlux, New Geographies, Volume, Journal of Architecture, Every Review, all of the places, contributing also to collections, including Architecture Against the Post-Political, This Thing Called Theory, Architecture and Feminisms, Landscape and Agency, and Architectural Affects After Deleuze and Guattari, also a very fresh publication. Thank you, Doug, for being with us. Eleni Axiotti is a researcher and educator at the Architectural Association and elsewhere in London as well. She's lecturer in contextual studies at the University of the Arts London, and here at the AA teaches history and theory of architecture. She completed her PhD at the AA on the dissolution of the architecture of the British welfare state in 2020. And her work focuses on architectural history in regard to issues of government, social policy, and political economy. Jane Randall, who unfortunately, as I said, cannot be here with us, she's professor of critical spatial practice at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL, our neighbor, and she has been introducing concepts of critical spatial practice and site writing through her authored books, The Architecture of Psychoanalysis, Silver, Site Writing, Art and Architecture, and The Pursuit of Pleasure. She works on the Bartlett's Ethics Committee Commission with Dr. David Roberts and the Ethics of Research Practice. I'm going to very shortly note, as Jane sort of requested us to, and it is the way in which we framed this panel. So maybe we can have some of the topics she was planning to bring also into consideration when we enter the discussion phase. She has just published a couple of articles entitled After the Strike, divided into two parts. Part one, the transitional space of the picket line, and part two, solidarity in and out. These articles have been published in a special issue of the journal Architecture and Culture, in volume 9, issue 1. The title of the special issue is Space to Think, the Contested Architectures of Higher Education. In these couple of articles, Jane explores the activities of strikers at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, over the 14-day period in the early spring of 2018, in which there was a 2-week-long strike of university academics at a very kind of noticeable event in the context of union activity in the UK university, possibly decades. This was a strike to protect pensions of university workers as around an issue with specific benefit scheme that the university, the UCL, was using. So what Jane was going to bring us was this kind of a series of considerations on how the academic, the architect as an academic and the architect as a critical practitioner kind of exist in a kind of an interesting and difficult relationship in a context in which the academic becomes organized as a worker, and the way in which this plays out in the spatial context of like the physicality of the university itself. So maybe we can have this as well on our minds when we have our discussions. So I'll kick it off to Doug, who will be opening with his presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Rick. So thanks very much, Rick, and Will, and Eleni for inviting me to speak at this event. And I'm just going to crack on. What I'm going to offer is essentially a kind of expanded remix of something I wrote and published in that most recent book, Critique of Architecture, with the new title, Institutions and Instruments of Architectural Critique. So the critique of capitalism, argued the Marxist historian Ellen Meeksins Wood in Democracy Against Capitalism, requires not only adaptations to every transformation of this system, but a constantly renewed critique of the analytic instruments designed to understand it. There can never have been a time, she continues, there can never have been a time since Marx's day when such a task was needed more urgently, as more and more branches of knowledge, both in cultural studies and in the social sciences, are absorbed into the self-validating assumptions of capitalism, or at least into a defeatist conviction that nothing else is possible. So the late Meeksins Wood was writing this some time ago, and our time has its own urgencies added to this, as I think already effectively outlined by Rick and Will in their introductions. But I think this point remains, that the analytic instruments employed in the critique of architecture likewise require constant renewal and should themselves be subject to imminent and institutional critique. Opposing the post-critical with the critical, and I'm going to say a lot about both of those things, more about the critical than the post-critical actually. Opposing these just as they existed before being challenged when made the foil for all the progressive claims issued by the turns to affect, new materialism, object-oriented ontologies, and actor-networked ontologies, is hardly in the dialectical spirit of critique itself. Critique has to move with its targets, and so what I'm offering is something which tries and might well fail in trying to be both kind of meta-critical and practical at the same time. So I'm going to say something about the institution of critique. So the goal in renewing the analytic instruments of the critique of architecture is a partisan one. Its object being to render these more effective against what Meeksins Wood describes as the defeatist conviction that nothing else is possible. To this end, Will Orr's recent remarks, well, actually, these was from 2019 in his PhD thesis, so recent-ish. His recent remarks on the conditions of possibility for what is now referred to as architecture theory and the institutionalization of critique from which it was formed are, I think, apposite. So Will argues in his thesis, which is called Counter-Realization, Architectural Ideology from Plan to Project, that the post-critical and the depoliticization of architecture occurred not in the late 1990s, as is usually assumed, including by people like me, in the architecture of neoliberalism, but in the 1970s. So he says that the periodization that opposed post-critical architecture to the heyday of critical architecture in the 1970s already misses the true post-critical turn, which for architectural discourse occurs precisely in the moment in which criticality becomes a self-conscious value for architectural discourse, which sublimates and transfigures the critique of architecture as bourgeois institution. So essentially, critique becomes sublimated by being institutionalized. So, and this is also following on what Will has to say there, where Tafuri's 1969 essay toward a critique of architectural ideology is a critique of architecture as ideology, or claims that much of what follows in its wake marks out architectural theory as itself ideological. As architecture theory passes through a succession of post-Marxian models drawn from semiotics, structuralism, post-structuralism, and deconstruction, it becomes progressively and effectively more anti-Marxian, long before its more recent Deleuzian affective and object-oriented turns. So architecture theory from the 70s onwards becomes a self-reflexive project, institutionalized within capital A architecture, that serves to validate its own institutional discourse. Furthermore, architecture effects this pivotal turn from the critique of its own institution to the institution of criticality at precisely the same historical juncture as it withdraws from its engagement with the plan. So this is a key Tafurian term, turning instead to the promise of autonomy offered in the project. So we have a kind of contemporary legacy of that, but that's kind of mediated by Michael Hayes and Peter Eisenman especially, of course. So as architecture attempts to distance itself from being assimilated into urban planning, as well as from the plan of capital in the era of the welfare state, it seeks refuge in the establishment of its formal autonomy from the economic institutions of capital. So there's already a kind of contradictory position, or a contradictory situation at least there. So Orr's charge is that the theory's critical edge is blunted, made effectively, if not by name, post-critical, before the coining of the post-critical in the very late 90s. And this happens in it being used to ideologically valorize the institution of architecture in its academic context. So let me go at that from another angle for the sake of clarity. So let's take, for example, the way that the critical theory of architecture propounded by Michael Hayes is founded on the idea of negation, founded on the idea that the power of architecture is a power to resist its absolute incorporation within capitalism through its form, and indeed its form of appearance. Now, it's easy to overlook that producing and circulating such a critical theory of architecture is itself a type of work, and a professional, class-based, and institutionally situated type of work at that. So when this work is invested in the putative powers of negation, we have also to ask how deep and how far negation actually runs, and at what point it flips over into its opposite, becoming in fact a project of affirmation. So this question becomes critical where everything is invested in the autonomous or the putatively autonomous powers of architecture to do the work of negating capital. While those who champion the powers and potentials of architecture do not reflect on the institutional situation from which such claims are produced, or are not even prompted to undertake this institutional critique of their own position, because they are insulated, more or less, by their own class position within the institution from suffering the most immediately negative effects and experiences of living in a capitalist society. In other words, critical negation is not extended to the institution from which critical negation is issued. And so it isn't recognized or reckoned with that criticality might be serving to positively affirm that institution whose existence, whose very existence, is based on reproducing the inequalities of class. In other words, still, within the larger totality with which critical theory, especially in its kind of Lucasian variants, is supposed to be concerned, a critical theory of architecture can all too easily serve as a means to valorize and legitimate an institution such as an elite university with a massive real estate portfolio. So to be clear, this is not an argument, and we've probably all been subject to this at some point. It's not an argument that those better protected from the cutting edge of capitalist conditions of exploitation have no place speaking negatively about capital, but it's an argument that I'm trying to articulate that critique should also be reflective of its own situation and its own conditions of possibility, and that critique is a more effective instrument when it is also a self-reflective, immanent and institutional one. So to return to Will's remarks, he also notes the institutionalization of critique and theory within architecture is indicative of a more widespread tendency towards what he describes as its sublimation. Now, something akin to this argument is also addressed and has also been addressed at length by both Perry Anderson and by E.P. Thompson. So in Anderson's The Tracks of Historical Materialism, he argues that semiotics, structuralism, and post-structuralism are incapable of adequately accounting for the historical and material dynamics at work in capitalism. These models, he argues, represent nothing less than the defeat of Marxism on the very terrain of Marxism itself, that of addressing the relations between structure and subject. In place of a Marxist account of these relations, so one that will be concerned with understanding them in terms of a process of ongoing struggle within particular historic and material conditions, structuralism, argues Anderson, proposes an ahistorical and unbridgeable gulf between the general rules of syntax and the utterance of particular sentences. In the preceding work of Anderson's unpremeditated trilogy, that's how he describes it himself, Considerations on Western Marxism, he'd set his sights on accounting for the separation of theory and practice, which is critical, I think, to this whole event today, is looking at the separation of theory and practice that had already been set in motion for him as early as the 1920s, with the advent of Western Marxism as such. Early generations, he argues, early generations of Marxist intellectuals, so he's thinking of Rosa Luxemburg, Rudolf Hilferding, Karl Kautsky, had insisted on the unity of theory and political practice, had been united in their scorn for professorial socialists. And I hope it's coming across that there's a kind of self-consciousness in everything I'm presenting here as myself a tenured professor. So they had served, so figures like Luxemburg, as members of communist and socialist parties, and they had taught within programs of workers' education organised by these. The so-called Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, however, he says, became progressively more detached from any overt political or party organisations and increasingly embedded in the setting of the university. So it's not straightforwardly a betrayal, and this is not what Anderson is saying, and he understands that this shift happens in part because the frankly traumatic circumstances of the 1930s and I guess Western Marxian intellectuals being caught between Stalinism and fascism, and all the conditions of exile and refuge implicated in these. But he also says that there's an element of choice in this, and that he argues that Adorno and Horkheimer, for instance, are exercising a choice in deciding to focus their attentions on philosophical and cultural concerns as opposed to those that are directly about political economy. So Anderson remarks of this turn, not merely did Marxist philosophy achieve a general plateau of sophistication far beyond its median levels of the past, but the major exponents of Western Marxism also typically pioneered studies of cultural processes in the higher ranges of the superstructures, as if in glittering compensation for their neglect of the structures and infrastructures of politics and economics, end quote. From Anderson's perspective, at least, it might then be said that the post-political can be further backdated, now from the 1970s to the 1930s. This being the critical juncture at which theory takes academic refuge from direct political engagement. What I have my eye on here in making this statement is there a possibility for some reconvergence that we're looking at now, again, given the remarks used to introduce this session. Turning now to E.P. Thompson, his extended essay, The Poverty of Theory, whose object of critique is the theory of Louis Althusser. And remember, of course, that Althusser is very, very important for Jameson. Jameson is very, very important for Hayes. And Jameson is also drawing on Tafuri. So there's a kind of network of intellectual thought that I'm raising here. So he says that the triumph in academia of theory over history, as represented in Althusser's structural Marxism, stands for nothing less than an extraordinary fracture in the Marxist tradition, actively opposed to the practice of history, which finds itself condemned as mere empiricism. So this is Althusser's famous charge against history and historical analysis. Althusser's structuralism, he writes, is a structuralism of stasis, departing from Marx's own historical method. So where for Anderson, the problem of structuralism lies in its failure to account for the relation between structure and subject. For Thompson, the subject, under the terms of this theoretical model, disappears entirely, well, almost entirely, other than as a functional effect of structure. So the result in any case is similar to that remarked upon by Anderson, which is the eviction from history of human agency. And Thompson is especially forthright in his critical assault on Althusser as the figurehead for theory. He calls him out for peddling idealism as materialism, and for being firmly lodged in the academic world of what he memorably describes as the lumpen intelligentsia. And so Althusser is held to be representative of an elitist division between theory and practice. Now, whatever one makes of Thompson's vituperative tone, his central argument bears decisively upon the whole question of the problematic of theory in general, as well as in its specifically architectural guises. The conjuncture from which theory emerged has, he writes, broken the circuits between intellectuality and practical experience, both in real political movements and in the actual segregation imposed by contemporary institutional structures. Now, Thompson's not alone in pointing to the problems inherent to structuralist, post-structuralist, and semiotic modes of practice in theory, and the way that these, in his words, break the circuits between intellectuality and practical experience. I think this, I mean, it might sound like a kind of arcane argument, maybe it is to some degree, but I think that given that, Jameson is still a major reference point in architectural theory, which understands itself as in some way radical and Marxian. And given that Althusser's position and method is so central to Jameson, especially in the really kind of famous architectural ventures, like the account of the Bonaventura Hotel, this is relevant. But what I wanted to say was that Pierre Bourdieu also has a kind of similar issue with these modes of analysis. He writes in the outline of a theory of practice that the objectivist knowledge of the analyst of art, culture, or society is, frankly, but never acknowledged as such, at odds with that of the practical knowledge and experience of the same objects, actions, and experience. From a practical position, so a position, more or less of everyday use and experience, these are not coded or in need of decoding or even necessarily defined in terms of communication at all. So it's only from the outsider's perspective, which is that of the institutionalized academic, that a map of these things needs to be produced in the first place, an interpretation taking up a position outside of and above conditions of practice. So Bourdieu's argument is not against interpretation, but what he's arguing for is like a kind of a dialectical moment where the kind of institutionalized objectifying academic knowledge is also recognized itself as a form of practice. But this is not what happens in the institutionalized critical theory of architecture. So, for example, in the endless talk about the silence of Mies, no one gets to question whether architecture is even capable of speech in the first place, or of asking who exactly is listening out for its having gone quiet anyway. And when everything gets flattened into a matter of language, symbols, and codes, then we're all too easily led into believing that resistance or negation in these terms, again, the infamous silence of Mies comes to mind. We're all too easily led into believing that resistance or negation in symbolic terms is more or less equivalent to practical forms of resistance and struggle, such as strikes, occupations, and riots. So there's an essay by Louis Martin, Frederick Jameson and Critical Architecture, where he makes this point, and I'll just read out a quote on this. He says that in Jameson's transcoding method, the text displaces ideology as mediator and achieves, first and foremost, a symbolic reunification, which is assumed to reflect on underlying unconscious unity of all levels or codes. This symbolic reunification is presented as something real, which enables him to posit that changes in one code reflect changes in others. Following this structuralist symbolic logic, autonomous resistance can be equated with political resistance because, as a symbolic instance, it cannot be separated from the world as a totality and reflects consequently a real phenomenon. So in other words, this is still Martin, in other words, symbolic resistance in architecture is assumed to be equivalent to political resistance on the basis of structural similarities. I think that's a really key point about or really kind of key question for us to address and discuss. So here the issue is not so much that of breaking the circuits between intellectuality and practical experience, but of their reconnection as a kind of false equivalence between symbolic negation and practical negation of capital. Relatedly, in addressing the relationship between architecture and capitalism as first and foremost symbolic, coded, or mythological, this privileges the relationship of such knowledge to those who have access and the facility to practice it. More importantly still, what too often goes missing from such modes of analysis is any account of how architecture is immediately implicated in the valorization of capital and the extractive, exploitative, and subjectifying operations through which it is produced. The financial operations, the labor of design, the labor and conditions of construction work, the extraction and processing of materials, the place of the project in practices of urban inclusion or inclusion, which are not only class-based, but gender-based and racially based as well. All of these things tend to go overlooked if we're understanding architecture as only having a symbolic relationship to capital. And I think just in terms of time, that's where I'll conclude this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. That was a very powerful opening.
Thank you.
Eleni, would you go now?
Yes, let me bear with me for a moment while I try to share my screen. And let's see. Okay. Okay, being aware of what Doug said about the historical, let's say, parameter in post-structural theory. I'm not sure my presentation exactly addresses the split of the academic as a political subject, but I'll try to share my thoughts on the current condition. So in this short presentation, I will try to briefly examine the academic discourse in regard to biopolitics in order to address its use and current limitations in the formation of political practices within architecture. The Foucauldian concepts of biopolitics and biopower have become extremely relevant in trying to make sense of the current situation, as a response of governments all over the world to the pandemic reminds us of biopolitical experiments. Intellectuals such as Giorgio Agamben have intervened to stress that the measures implemented in response to the pandemic are for them an exercise in the biopolitics of state exemption. This state of exemption, sorry. This intervention sparked a debate between academics on how to think of biopolitics as a form of control or as a beneficial necessary social regulation. Following Foucault and not Agamben, who has a different understanding of biopolitics can be defined as the application and impact of political power on all aspects of human life. Foucault defines what he names as biopower as a set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, which can be observed since the 18th century, coinciding with the development of capitalism. He makes us aware of the crossing of a historical threshold where biological processes become political problems and are addressed by governments. So biopolitics are characterized by an emphasis on the protection of life. We are no longer governed as political subjects of law, but as living beings that are part of a population. Foucault explains this in his lectures on security, territory, population, and he says that biopolitics operate through the management of population using security controls. And he locates biopolitics in the problems of the city, of the production and circulation of goods, and in medicalization of urban space. There is a history of technology of security that Foucault demonstrates, and he shows how security tries to plan a milieu in terms of events and possible elements working through the environment. Despite many academic interpretation of biopolitics as an application of power in order to control the population, Foucault in his writings never actually characterizes biopolitics as good or bad. As Daniele Lorenzini underlines, and I quote, "We do not have to be for or against biopolitics, but address it as a historical event that defines, at least in part, the way in which we are governed, the way in which we think about politics and about ourselves." Nonetheless, I would also like to propose the possibility of some form of positive and democratic biopolitics. In the current condition of social insecurity, of poverty, lack of healthcare and inequality, it is clear the need for some form of regulation where the basic needs of the population in terms of health and well-being are addressed. Biopolitics have been discussed in architectural academia and research extensively. Sven Olof Wallenstein in Biopolitics and the Emergence of the Modern Architecture considers architecture as an essential part of the biopolitical machine that works through the planning and the construction of the built environment. He notes that since the late 18th century, and I quote, new conceptions of public facilities, hygiene and public order turned architecture into a node in a network of practices through which individuals were formed and the modern social space emerged. One could argue that a form of positive, let's say, in its wider definition, biopolitics can be seen in the formation of the European welfare states during the post-war period. There, architecture's role in the application of such politics relates to the building of housing, healthcare, and educational infrastructures. The welfare states, through the biopolitical planning of the population, applied a reformist socioeconomic compromise within capitalism. Through state intervention and the realization of public welfare programs, they covered the basic biological and social needs of people in healthcare, housing, education, and old age. This way, they achieved the expansion of citizenship to include not only civil and political rights, but also social rights. They decommodified certain domains of life and turned architects to a large degree into technical workers that design, build, and address the biological and social needs of people. In academia, the welfare state has been criticized for the application of biopolitical power, both from the right through neoliberalism that advocated for freedom from state regulation, but also from the left. Jeremy Thiel notes that, and I quote, the functionalism of the welfare state is a mechanism for reordering behavior. In the white light-filled spaces of humane modernism, you will behave properly. The paternalism of the welfare state is specialized in the frozen spaces of our social housing, hospitals, and schools. End of quote. And this is exactly where architecture of the welfare state fails for Thiel, as life actually overcomes by political power and regulation. This is an argument that aligns with the criticism of urban planning policies and modernist housing in the 1960s. Jane Jacobs, in her book Death and Life of Great American Cities, claimed that planning overlooked the complexities of city lives and the issues of heritage and character that were linked to the local communities. Instead, she advocated for a bottom-up approach. Interestingly, the criticism of the faceless welfare institutions that exercised by political control and oppressed individual freedom through the practices of a nanny state was an argument shared at the time by both the political left and right. Henri Lefebvre, from the point of view of the left, argued against the anonymous urban institutions of the state that commodified urban life to serve capitalism. Instead, he argued for a right to the city through the social production of space and criticized the repressive state institutions and regulations. This discussion, one could say, that reminds us of the current discussions of the application of biopolitical control over the cities during the pandemic, but also previous discussion in regard to the ownership and control of spaces within cities. On the rise of neoliberal ideology also condemned the welfare state for intervening in the lives of individuals, creating dependencies and controlling their freedoms and abilities to develop and prosper through the practice of personal choices and enterprises. Thus, the welfare apparatus of biopolitical government was under severe criticism, but also transformation in the mid-1960s. Unfortunately, one needs to acknowledge that both these criticisms from the left and the right, although it might have not been their initial purpose and intention, contributed to the dissolution of the welfare state and worked against planning and any form of socioeconomic regulation. In parallel, the reformist architectural practices of the European welfare states started giving way to radical architectural practices of constant innovation, which coincide with the establishment of neoliberal forms of government based on the model of enterprise, eventually leading to the depoliticization of the architectural profession, which continues till today. Since the late 1960s, we gradually moved away from any positive biopolitical planning by the state that relied on social rights, and we have moved towards self-regulation, the management of the individuals as human capital, and enterprises based on requirements of the market as the place for the establishment of truth and priorities. Foucault, in his lectures on the birth of biopolitics, explains that the application of biopolitical power coincides with the development of liberal capitalism and takes the forms of both welfare state policies, but most importantly of neoliberal governance. The one form is regulated by the state, while the other one establishes truth in the operations of the market. Actually, Foucault in his lectures traces a genealogy of neoliberal governmentality as a form of biopolitical power. Today, although there is a reflection and research produced on biopolitics within architecture, these efforts remain merely theoretical. Practices such as forensic architecture use architectural knowledge and skills in order to reveal and criticize the effects of negative biopolitics, the biopolitics of control and of exploitation. In reality, the biopolitical implications of the architectures we produce are not really considered in practice. Moreover, in times of deregulation and in absence of any social security, one needs to wonder whether there is a possibility of positive and democratic biopolitical planning and how architects can contribute to it. In the current times of socioeconomic inequalities and ecological disasters, it is necessary to build infrastructures of social care and replan the built environment to address the basic socioeconomic needs and ecological emergencies. However, this is difficult when planning is related to master planning and regenerational projects, and any biopolitical interventions are directed towards neoliberal self-management in the purpose of profit. This is why it is essential to first address this the material and economic limitations by politicizing our practices. A critique of architecture as a form of radical disillusionment of the profession that Douglas Spencer proposes in his recent book is necessary. And relates to this aspect of self-reflection that we need to have as a practice. But I think that we as architects need also to start practicing as active political subjects by participating in the existing material struggles and try to find ways to somehow contribute to the technical realization of biopolitical planning of care for all. So thank you. These are my thoughts for now. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Eleni. That was great. Yeah, I mean, the purpose of this, we're running a little bit late, but we still have half an hour within this panel, is to then construct a discussion on top of these initial presentations. This discussion can take the form of the speakers talking to each other, but we also very much welcome participation from the audience. So if anyone would like to raise your hand to ask a question or make a comment, say something, please do that and we will unmute you and you can speak openly, or if you prefer, you can just leave comments and questions in the chat as well. Although I must say we certainly prefer if you raise your hand and turn on your camera, and we make this look a little bit as close as possible to being inside an actual physical environment altogether. So I guess I kick off the discussion a little bit. I suppose I'm going to do the thing that moderators usually do, right? There is a kind of an interesting articulation between Doug. Oh, Lukáš has just raised his hand. I'll just finish this quick thought. Doug has left us with this notion that there is a transformation in the way left intellectuals see the role of critique and how critique effectively even functions as a practice, as a kind of a historical discussion that can be dated in different ways, all the way, possibly all the way back to the 70s, and even potentially all the way back to the 30s, when there is a sort of a certain degree of separation between intellectuals in what we might call kind of left academia, I guess, and the concrete political struggle, right? This has many potential political causes for why this happens, but there is this transformation of the way the critic, the left intellectual, thinks of its practice, and in relation to a transformation in its articulation with the actual concrete political struggle. Eleni, you talk about, you give us a kind of a concrete example on top of the issue of this category of biopolitics in the way it tends to be perceived very often in our discipline, I think. And you give very clear examples of this as sort of like biopolitics is bad, and it's biopolitics is when the government does things, right? And you say very open and very clearly that people dying of lack of healthcare because they can't afford private healthcare and there is no public healthcare is also biopolitics. Like there's a biopolitics within the market, the neoliberal market dynamics. But in the context of our discipline, there is this very clear tendency of having this sort of radical denunciation of biopolitics, while at the same time in the current moment we see like the concreteness of the political struggle is very clearly not against biopolitics, but for democratic control over biopolitical processes, right? So I wonder if, like, at this level, we can have a certain discussion on how, like, this is a concrete example of how the academic, or kind of the left academic, frames a problem that exists in the political struggle, but the academic intellectual kind of doesn't get it right, and why they don't get it right, right? Lukáš, would you like to speak now, I guess? Just let me find you so I can unmute you.
I think I'm unmuted.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Thank you. That was great. I have a question which directly relates to one of the important points made by Doug, but I think it also relates to Eleni's comments. And so my question is really about this argument about the institutionalization of critique in the academia in the 1970s, or since the 1970s, and specifically architectural critique in an architectural academia. And so my question is this: to what extent do you think this process needs to be seen as really part of a much broader process of institutionalization of critique within the post-war state? And that whether the West, but also perhaps at the time in the other worlds, the second world, and perhaps to some extent even the third world. And so I'm asking this question from my own research and my first book, which focused on the Marxist critic mentioned by Eleni, namely Henri Lefebvre. And one of the reasons why I was interested in Lefebvre, and one of the reasons why I think his work is incredibly relevant for our discussion, is that precisely he can be seen, and his work in kind of a very dynamic way can be seen as kind of developed vis-a-vis that process of institutionalization of critique in the post-war French state, arguably increasingly post-Fordist state. And Lefebvre had a teaching career, but he was not really a professor. His academic affiliation was pretty much precarious until he was in his 60s. However, he had been really importantly in many ways related to all sorts of studies, which were commissioned studies, typically urban studies rather than architectural studies. But that sometimes the border is sometimes fluid, and it was very clearly his work was part of that rethinking and critique of the French urbanism of the immediate post-war period. And again, that is somebody who has mentioned many times that his direct enemy is the state. Right, that one of the reasons why Lefebvre was so interested in Yugoslavia, precisely because the withering away of the state was perhaps his number one objective, political objective. And so, that is, and so I was wondering to what extent this institutionalization of critique, precisely since the 1970s, as you said, needs to be seen as part of this bigger process. And the last comment, I think that in this country, in the UK, where so much of research is funded by the government with kind of very clear objectives, I think that is a really relevant question.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much, Luca. I'll have a first go at answering that. So I think the first thing I'd say is that in a short presentation, some of the kind of subtleties and subtle shadings of the argument get squeezed out. So I'm, in many ways, I'm quite as loyal to Adorno as you are to Lefebvre. So it's not that I want to kind of cast him in a bad light, but in a simplistic fashion, I think, and he had his own struggles, of course, in terms of being exiled, and he writes quite hilariously about how he's not taken seriously in the UK and ends up in Los Angeles, of course. Lefebvre, you're right. You would know much more about him, of course, than me, but he's an interesting figure, also because of his connection with the Situationists, that kind of brief period in which he was working with De Boer before they fell out. So yeah, he's an interesting figure in terms of his connection directly and with and through the Situationist with what we'd understand as forms of struggle outside of the academic institution. I think the issue about being against the state and Lefebvre's problem with the state, I mean, that's perhaps something that Eleni would like to say more about. But I think in raising that issue, and my response as well to Eleni's presentation, is it really kind of raises the issue of the point at which critique and the critique of capitalism is actually kind of retrograde move that imagines that if only everyone would leave us alone, we could be who we truly are, so that we can imagine, having no biopolitics at all, or that we can imagine living outside of a political economy at all. Whereas there are other currents very famous currents with Marxism, like Leninism, which would take the state as the vehicle for its own abolition, in the same way that Marx takes the working class as the vehicle for its own self-abolition too. But it's also working through capital to something beyond that, which might have moments of reform along the way. So yeah, I think perhaps what we recognise from this perspective, from our own historical moment, is what is problematic about simply stating that the state is the enemy, rather than a more nuanced kind of dialectical approach to its operations and the possibilities we have within it. I think that might be something that other speakers have something to say about in later sessions, but I'll let Eleni speak to this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the use of the way I use Lefebvre in the presentation, of course, it was in a very simplistic way, and his work needs to be read within the historical context, no? Because I mean, we can understand maybe the effects of the critique of left to the welfare state at the time now, but at the moment, of course, the politics were much more complex to that. What I know from Lefebvre's work is his relation to Sefri, the Centre des Études des probably you know it better, Lucas, where they basically did research on institutional architecture, no, and developed actually, I think, critiques of, for example, psychiatric institutions and things like that within the university. So I think maybe he was not a professor, but I think he was affiliated and somehow he was involved in projects like that. So in a sense, he was, I think, developing this critique within the fact that the French state would allow these projects to develop and exist. You know? Yeah, that's the first point. Yeah, the second point in regard to the funds which I think is interesting, to funding research and critique nowadays in UK, it is. I think it is very relevant, because if you have a look and you try to have to fund your PhD, for example, or any kind of research in UK at the moment, you basically need to apply for a job which is prescribed. So if you want to do anything independently, so any kind of, when I was trying to do my research or his, we could not find any funding on that. So it is the critique at the moment is not something that is, on one hand, the institutions require from us, the academic institutions, to produce research and academic work. On the other hand, they don't allow the space, the time, the funds for that, but also they prescribed very clearly which are the directions of the research. No, so it is. I think it is a very important thing at the moment in academia. It's something we need to address. Yeah, I don't know if that answers any of the questions.
Thanks, Eleni. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Lukasz. Claude, I should unmute you, and I suppose you would be able to speak now.
Right. Hi. I think, Eleni, thank you for sort of starting to bring in the reality of the academic complex. Just for a bit of context, I was one of the co-editors of the Architecture and Culture journal that Jane's articles are written in, and part of the context of that was really trying to account for what was happening on the ground as a sort of like very, very urgent, critical moment. And please go and read lots of the other articles, which are all about that, like really incredible accounts of what is going on in academia at the moment. Because in a way, I kind of want to talk a bit about teaching and labour in architecture, and throw out a question about the idea of academia as a space to think, and that's kind of like why we use it as our title, seems to be really diminishing. You know, we have a lot of meetings about what is now called teaching delivery. Like it's like stuff that we are expected to kind of process and chunk out to our students. Academic administration, and also meetings about the floor plans of our new building by Herzog and de Meuron, funded by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I mean, you know, this world is like so weird. It's not even Department of Education. And then there's the current political climate that we had the news yesterday of the 50% of cut to courses like art and design, which is part of the government's kind of attack on humanities and arts, and indeed any kind of subjects where there might be critical thought and practice, or there might be some kind of radical political realization through education, either in the students and the staff. So this is like Gavin Williamson's attack on free speech, and sort of very explicitly saying they're not going to fund institutions that will not commit to free speech. And also the attacks on critical race theory, which is obviously an entirely academically placed thing. So I kind of wanted to, these questions just seem so urgent, and the theorization of them seems already like it's like a utopia what they were dealing with. Yeah. And how do we keep up? How do we stay critically astute? How do we stay politically energized and able to enact any kind of, not even maybe resistance, but maybe a kind of like holding up? I don't know if we can even advance anything, but just how do we deal with the current moment, really?
Yeah, as well as I do. Well, you will probably have a better idea of how to do that. I mean, my response is just to say that in what I'm laying out, I need to be clear that it would be ridiculous for me to say, and this is what we should be doing now, and we should be critically self-reflective. Really, the underlying point is we're already at that moment precisely because the material and historical conditions kind of force that upon us. Yeah. So I keep having this conversation with people about like people who are a bit older than me in terms of, what you could afford basically, and the kind of lifestyle you could afford as a professor or even as a senior lecturer, compared to what that means now to be an academic working in London. It's just kind of crazy. So yeah, there are just the basic economic circumstances and degree of exploitation, as well as all the other more explicitly or overtly political things weighing down upon some of us. Are the motor of activism. It just becomes necessary. So yeah, I don't have any insights in exactly how we should do. We should address that. We should do it together. Obviously, we should be talking about how we do that. We should be producing publications like the one you've just edited, where we share our experiences and find other ways of doing that. We need to connect. And again, it's not me kind of saying we should do this. It is happening. I think that people are increasingly, like in the US, working in academia and working as architects, and in the democratic socialists of America, and maybe in the architecture lobby as well. So there's all sorts of kind of new coordinations and relays between the institution and other forms of struggle, the inside and the outside. And really my tiny contribution is just to kind of think about, okay, so what does that mean for how we theorize the relationship between architecture and capital?
Yeah. Well, if I may add, I think from the moment that education has become part of the basically in UK, it is one of the heaviest industries, in terms of producing capital. So from the moment that actually education has become a commodity that we need, an enterprise that we need to sustain, I think things are very difficult, but we need to keep engaging on the political struggles. But I think also we need to start questioning the way institutions are governed and the policies are applied within. So for example, there are discussions about I see in some of the universities that I work, like 3 different governors or deputies, and having huge salaries, and being directed in different and there is not a transparency. It's not clear how all the systems work, except from what arrives at us at the end, as requirement for us to produce. So I think we need to go back into questioning the structures of governance of these institutions as far as is it possible. Maybe that's one first step, I think. Trying to maybe within take some kind of control, since I don't think we have much control of the outside at the moment. I don't know if that helps at all.
If I can say something myself, I guess, in the absence of more raised hands, would anyone else would like to raise hand or leave a comment, even in chat? We're open for all contributions, although we do not have that much more time. In fact, yeah. I guess this discussion on what are the concrete conditions that we are given in academia as intellectual laborers, which obviously defines the way in which academics in general tend to see conditions of production in society at large, right? Because that is a specific subset of conditions of production within which they operate. But it seems to me relatively clear that there is a kind of an interesting historical sort of paradox in the way this discussion develops roughly since, I don't know, the 1960s. The critique of the state as a sort of general abstract category, like Lukács was talking about, Lefebvre develops. It is a significant departure historically from the Marxist notion of the state as being kind of operative to the dominance of a specific ruling class over the classes that it exploits, right? In Marx, the state is kind of concrete. It exists as a servant, an operator to a political economic structure. And what it feels that starts happening among the lefts in many ways in the 60s with the kind of development and consolidation of the welfare state as this kind of notion that, okay, capitalism is going to totally harmonize and smooth out its contradictions with this new way of organizing itself, the welfare state, where it makes workers happy. And therefore, we are going to lose the possibility of revolution. And so we start having this kind of concept of the state as an abstract entity that must be combated in its abstraction. But what seems interesting there, I think, and I suppose I'll ask it as a question, is how this was a fight against the welfare state seen as a kind of a more perverse version of the bourgeois state, because it constructed kind of subjective conditions that made it seem insurmountable. And the critique of the welfare state was that it was conditioning and regulating and interfering and subsuming the activity of everyone, including intellectuals, right? But what we've been seeing now, and it's becoming skin deep apparent and felt in academics, among academics today, is that it's actually the neoliberal state which organizes itself it's a bourgeois state in neoliberalism, as opposed to the welfare, the bourgeois state in the welfare moment. That so drastically increases the mechanisms of control and limitation of academic freedom to work and produce, even though the neoliberal state envelops itself in a rhetoric of making the state smaller, right? And yet it makes it bigger, or at least more oppressive and more limiting for our activity as intellectual producers than the welfare state ever did. Because in the welfare state, we were teachers and we would pay the salary, and we would have a relatively okay career progression horizon. And within that logic, we had certain stability in our material conditions in order to develop our own researches and materials and write our books and etc. And in the current moment, that's not the case anymore. But the argument is that the state is being made smaller, right? So this is a very interesting paradox that I launch.
Well, I think there is this discussion about also bureaucracy, on how much bureaucracy. I mean, one of the critiques of the welfare state was, that the state became very bureaucratic. No, there was such a big structure. The operations of the state were too big, so they were not. They could not be sustained and made. They were much more restrictive as well. But we see now that actually bureaucracy continues and even becomes even larger for each one of us. But we have to deal with it individually, no? So it becomes something that has been transposed from the state and organized by the state to each one of us to deal individually. And if any failure on that or any difficulty, it's your own responsibility. So yeah, I don't know if that helps at all as a comment. Or if Doug has any thoughts on that. He has much more experience than me in teaching.
I don't know that I have anything especially useful to add to that, because I've already said quite a lot. Will has raised his hand, so I would like to give him the floor.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I think the question of the critique of the state, I mean, the question is critique of the state from what perspective? I'm more familiar with like Italian Marxist theory from that era. And it was clear that the critique of the state or of the reformism of the union movement and the left parties was made from the basis of the working class conceived in a certain way. And there were particular historical limitations of that basis that I think became clear over the years. But I think what you see is a separation and autonomizing of the intellectual as critic away from that basis, away from that class basis. So I think in the contemporary moment, the trick is that we have we're trained into a kind of a critical thinking, and the education in critical academia and in philosophy assumes the autonomy of academic discourse as a political platform to make a critique, to make a political movement. And maybe to add to what Claude was saying, I think the trick is that we have to kind of accept that we can't reverse the situation from within the academy, through academic discourse. No one is listening at that level. I think we need to reconnect to the larger political struggle outside the academy to find that larger basis of struggle. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just want to add to that, kind of repeating what I said earlier in some sense, that we have to do that because it immediately presses on us, or some of us, obviously more than others, as our immediate condition, not as a kind of enlightened recognition that we live in an ivory, some of us live in a kind of insulated ivory tower and we should care about normal people, but just like we are more or less normal people experiencing the same conditions of exploitation as do others. Yeah, but I think we're at this point where we've been dealt an interesting, if not a good hand, by the ruse of history, which is that, I think it's what critique should be doing anyway. That's like the point of what I was trying to say in my paper to some degree, is that there is originally, like from Marx 11's thesis on Feuerbach, there's a the need to understand the relationship between philosophy and political struggle. That kind of breaks apart in the 20s and 30s, becomes exacerbated, that distinction from the 70s onwards. But now, the kind of traumatic circumstances of the present are forcing on us some sort of reconvergence. But, we're in the midst of that and trying to work out what shape that will take, what forms that will take for us.
Great. So in the absence of more participants wanting to say something, I guess we can close the first panel. Then we will have a brief interval before the second panel, which starts at 4:45. Does that sound good?
I'm going to add links to Jane's texts into the chat for everyone.
All right, thanks everyone, and see you in 10 minutes or so.